Hello, and welcome to my presentation of my TE 849 semester teaching log. I'm Christina Crasium, the creator of this presentation, and I will be discussing the content that I covered over the last several weeks in my classroom, as well as the conclusions that I derived about my own teaching and learning as a result of keeping this log. I hope that you enjoy. So throughout the semester, I engaged my students in a variety of methods for thinking about and using literature. So among the methods that I used for teaching were to introduce the big idea. So I would often give them a few words or show them the title of the story, or sometimes I would just simply give them a question, such as how do pictures help us to better understand a story, to get them to think more broadly about the topic before jumping into the actual text. I would activate prior knowledge with them, so getting them to think about what they know or what they think they knew about a given topic. Sometimes this would just be in the form of a simple discussion, and other times we would form a KWL on the board to generate some ideas in writing before we jumped into the book. And then we would revisit the KWL afterwards to see how much of what we knew or what we thought we knew was accurate, and then how much had we learned as a result of reading. We would do picture walks on occasion, as well as making predictions. This is something that I personally feel very comfortable with as a teacher, and something that my students are comfortable with doing as well. We do this quite a bit in our literature circles throughout the year, so it's always fun to get their responses on what they think is about to happen in the story. Reading aloud, either I would read aloud to the students or they would read aloud to one another in smaller groups, depending on what the activity was or what the theme was for the week. We would do whole class or small group discussions. Again, this would depend on the format of the format of the week. And then presentations on findings. So this was in selected weeks where the group was split into smaller groups, such as in our week on traditional literature, which I will talk about shortly. Week 3 of this course was really the first week of our teaching log, so I decided to use a portion of the theme we did in week 3, which was on paying attention to the visual elements that make up books. We read 2 different stories. The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen and illustrated by Jerry Pinkney, and Make Way for Ducklings, written and illustrated by Robert McCloskey. As we perused these books, I simply asked students to keep in mind the question I posed to them at the beginning of the lesson, which was, how do pictures help us to understand a story? We talked about various terms used in picture book language, as was discussed in Sipes' article, and the students really enjoyed comparing and contrasting these books, which both centered on ducklings, but are very different in their illustrations. One student noticed how much she liked the colors that were used as a medium in The Ugly Duckling, while another said, and I quote, "The different points of view, in Make Way for Ducklings is cool. We get to see them up close and from a bird's eye view. I also really like how much detail there is, even though there is just one color." When asked about how pictures help us to understand a story, the general consensus was that illustrations show us aspects of the story that the words don't always say. Overall, the students found value and beauty in both stories and came to understand that illustrations can play a crucial role in gaining more information about a story than what the author dictates. So week 4 was centered on traditional literature and was honestly probably my favorite week, just because the students were extremely enthusiastic and motivated to jump into this type of literature. And I'm pretty sure just the fact, too, that they have had prior experiences, a lot of them, with this type of literature helped as well. So the picture you're viewing is of my whiteboard, and in 3 columns, my class and I brainstormed a list of elements that comprise traditional literature. I realize that we may not have gotten all of them, but I felt this was definitely a good start. We also discussed the various types of traditional literature that's out there, such as tall tales, fairy tales, folk tales, etc. I started them off with Once Upon a Time and the Home Away from Home sequence on the board, as we read about in one of our course articles. The class went from there. They just took it and ran. As the girls came up with elements, I wrote them on the board. I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of elements that they came up with. It far exceeded the expectations that I had for, especially in the beginning of this particular lesson. I figured maybe as we got further into the readings, they might start to brainstorm a little bit more, but pretty much all of this was done right from the beginning. So after our brainstorming session, the girls were divided into 3 groups, and they were each given 3 books to read of various categories within traditional literature. The girls were to read stories to see how many elements they could spot. Each group was successfully able to do this. One group had the tall tale John Henry and loved how the larger-than-life element was shown in their particular story, because that was that was the only tall tale that I had, so they didn't find this particular element in any of the other stories. Another group discussed how mothers need to get their acts together because they're so mean to their children, so I found this kind of humorous. I suppose that in many of these stories, the girls kind of have a point. So the girls really enjoyed finding various elements in traditional literature, and I came to realize that they found a lot of value in looking at stories that they've heard many times before, such as Hansel and Gretel and the Three Billy Goats Gruff, from a different perspective. One student in particular noted how she thought she'd be bored reading the same stories she already knew. She kind of did an eye roll when she first found out she was reading the stories that she had because she was so familiar with them. But she later told me that she wasn't bored this time because she liked having a different reason to read them. So I found that to be really successful. In week 5, I jumped into multicultural literature. I chose the story Moses, When Harriet Tubman Led Her People to Freedom, by Carol Boston Weatherford and illustrated by Kadir Nelson, because it had won the Coretta Scott King Award for excellence in contributing to the African American experience in a positive way, as well as the fact that this story ties Harriet Tubman to the biblical Moses. I realized that the comparison between these giants of history would make for a great discussion. So I led the lesson by asking the students what they knew about Harriet Tubman. I mostly got blank looks, but one girl noted that she was a slave who helped other slaves find freedom. Another girl said that she was from the South, but she had to go north to get free. So we had minimal prior knowledge of this character. No one spoke to her characteristics as a person. They only knew what she looked like on the outside, but they couldn't necessarily tell me about who she was as a person. So I made note of this early on. So as we read, the students made beautiful connections between Tubman and Moses, and we talked about Tubman's struggles in journeying to freedom. One girl mentioned that she was brave because she could have been killed, but she kept trusting that God would help her to freedom. Another girl talked about how the pictures helped her to understand the awful conditions that Tubman had to undergo, such as hiding among the potato stash at one of the stops at the Underground Railroad for days before it was safe to finally continue her journey, which you can see in the picture on the right side of the slide. So in discussing whether or not she should ever have had to worry about trying to escape slavery in the first place, the girls unanimously said no, she shouldn't have had to worry because she shouldn't have been a slave in the first place. She should have been free to make her own choices like any person should. One girl said, if I had been around back then, and I quote, I would have had a house on the Underground Railroad so that she could stay with me. I would want to help her be free. I came to realize after using this story with the girls that they're genuinely very interested in reading about injustices and thinking of ways that they can make our world better. So it kind of warmed my heart to think that these girls will be our future leaders and that they're already thinking of ways that they can help others. After discovering the website on How to Tell the Difference, a guide, I decided to use the questions found there to help me establish whether or not I had chosen an appropriate book with Will Hobbs's Bear Dream. After critically analyzing the questions and the text, I determined that this book meets some of the criteria, but there were other areas that did not. I did some research on the author prior to reading the story and discovered that he is not of Native American descent. I did find, however, that he has had first-hand experiences with the Ute tribe in Colorado, for whom this book is based from, and he wrote Bear Dream after experiencing the traditional Ute bear dance in the 1970s. The descriptions he makes in the stories are based on his own personal experiences, but he did not go to anyone from the Uti tribe specifically to speak with them about the content in his story. Sky Sisters, on the other hand, which was written by Jan Bordeaux Wabus and illustrated by Brian Daenis, and I apologize if I'm saying these last names incorrectly, does meet the criteria, all of the criteria listed on How to Tell the Difference, a guide, and was listed among the AICL's authentic and appropriate books. So I chose this as a piece to compare with Bear Dream. So before introducing Bear Dream, I asked the girls to jot down some notes about what they thought when they heard the term Native American. The responses I received are shown on the slide on the left-hand side. I read Bear Dream to the girls, and they enjoyed the book overall, and they thought that the illustrations were great. When I asked them to compare the story to what they, quote, know about Native Americans, they found some similarities, which I found interesting. They noted that numbers 1, 3, 5, 8, and 12 were applicable to this story. So specifically, they were seeing characters who were very dark-skinned. They wore feathers. They carried bows and arrows around with them. They hunted and were considered to the students to be wild. And they had traditions, and specifically they were referring to the bear dance. I asked them if they felt that this book represents all Native Americans accurately even today. And of my 10 students, only one of them said no, which I found both enlightening and disturbing at the same time. So when I asked this one student why, she stated that her family is Native American and they don't dress or act like the characters in the story. So I could tell that some of the other students felt uncomfortable after she shared this information because they realized that they were wrong in their notions that all Native Americans are exactly the same and that they're all representative of the images that we see when we watch movies like Walt Disney's Peter Pan. I then introduced Sky Sisters to the girls, and I asked them to consider what they learn about the main characters so that they could compare the information from that story to what they felt they've always known about Native Americans. The information on Sky Sisters can be found on the next slide. Sky Sisters is the story of two Ojibwa girls who go on a journey to see the sky spirits late at night. The story depicts them as two girls who look and act just like any two sisters that we'd commonly encounter in Western culture. The story takes place in Alaska. I asked the girls after reading to them what stood out to them about this story, compared to the list that we had contrived of what they thought Native Americans were at the beginning of this whole lesson. Their responses are listed on the slide. The only one that was the same as their initial list about Native Americans was number 8 on this slide, which is that they have traditions. I noticed that the one girl who initially said that the Native Americans in Bear Dream didn't represent all Native American tribes was smiling a lot through this story. And I reflected a lot on her reaction and linked it to what we read about in our weeks 5 and 6 articles about how students can be made to feel ashamed when literature portrays their race or culture negatively, but they feel proud when their culture is portrayed positively. I could definitely see that coming out of her in this sense, this feeling of pride. And I was glad to see that my student felt proud at the end of reading Sky Sisters. And even more glad that my students came to an understanding that not everyone can or should be classified the same way. I learned from this week just how critical it is to select literature that accurately reflects on a given culture. In the past, I would have easily selected Bear Dream as an authentic representation of Native American culture based on the background of the author without discussing the differences of Native American cultures past and present with my class. After doing a lot of reflecting on the misconceptions that my students had regarding Native Americans, I decided to devote week 7 to discussing the causes and consequences of stereotyping. I began by asking them what stereotyping was, and not one of them had an answer for me. So I asked them, How do you feel when someone describes you as something you are not? For example, you're all females, correct? And they responded with yes, so I continued. So, because you're female, you should always be quiet. You should also love to sing and dance, which I know many of you do, but you shouldn't like to play video games. Well, the protests began. They started chiming in with things like, I love video games, I'm way better than my brother, and we're never quiet. I can personally attest to that second one. But I asked them, so you don't like what I'm saying about you? Well, it must be true about you because I know some girls who don't like to play video games, so all of you must not like them then. Again, the protests emerged. I then faced a girl in my class who I know loves blue as her favorite color. I told her that I had 2 cupcakes to give away, one with pink frosting and one with blue. I would give one for her and she could take the other one for her brother. I gave her the blue one and she lit up. And that's when I said, take this one home for him. Well, crestfallen, she responded, but I want this one. Blue is my favorite color. I responded, but you're a girl. You get the pink cupcake. Pink is a girl color and blue is a boy color. Everyone knows that. Again, the explosions erupted, and I got a glare from that girl that could have melted the frosting right off that cake no matter what color it was. At this point, I could tell that they were beginning to understand what it meant to stereotype. I asked them how it felt to be put in a box and judged in a certain way just because of how they looked. Well, they hated it. I explained to them that everyone else hates it too. No one wants to be labeled a certain way because of how others think they should be. I came to learn that it's not too early to discuss stereotypes with students this young. They were already beginning to accept stereotypes as truth without realizing it. I regarded discussions on stereotyping as a bit too controversial in the past, but I've since come to realize that these students not only need the education on stereotypes, but they also embrace discussions that center on deciphering truth from fallacies. In week 8, we looked at picture books from across time. Though this is a theme we discussed very early in the course, this lesson was pushed back due to snow days and scheduled breaks in our school calendar. We visited an old favorite of mine in terms of the story we used, The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams Bianco. I used the original version, published in 1922, and the anniversary edition, adapted in 2013 by illustrator Charles Santor. I wanted to see how students would take to looking at the same text from 2 different time periods and with 2 different styles of illustrating. Because the texts were the same, I read the original story to them and then asked them for their opinions of the 2 books. I had the girls break into pairs and analyze the books side by side, writing their observations on a double column piece of paper. I did this because I wanted them to have more time to carefully look at the pictures, to hold the books and feel their pages, and to thoughtfully reach conclusions about their feelings on the illustrations. So, in terms of how it went, overall the girls were very receptive to the idea of reflecting on paper. I felt as though they were more engaged in the story and they were beginning to make observations and inferences through the added effort they were using in analyzing the books that they might not have done otherwise had they simply been sitting and listening. Asking students to analyze the story side by side went extremely well. The girls were engaged and looked closely at each picture to give as much detail as they could. So I've included some of their observations from my teaching log on the next slide. In taking a look at the 2 different versions and what the students had to say about them, overall, the students did prefer the 2013 version. I think just in general, they said it had better shading, it had more color, it had more pictures, it had more detail within the pictures. Specifically looking at the last bullet point in the 2013 version, it had more details that described the background of the story, like seeing the titles on the books of the boys' bookshelf. So it really went into immense detail and gave the students a lot to look at. Whereas the 1922 version, as they described, was more dull. They felt it had sloppy coloring, whereas I think it was just the illustrator's style of sketching. One student did mention that there was a cool sketch style to it, so I think she kind of understood that style a little bit better. The 1922 version had more of the same colors. It was more just a yellowish tinge to the pages, which may or may not have been off-putting to the students. one of the more humorous observations they made in the 1922 version was that this book looked like it was more for elementary school. And I kind of cracked up when I read that because I thought, well, if you consider the 1922 version to be for elementary school, what do you consider the 2013 version to be? So I was kind of curious as to their thoughts on that, but they couldn't really give me much more of an explanation. I think they just figured that having something a little more basic meant that it had to be elementary, and I wanted them to understand that just because something um, is made with more detail and more color, it doesn't mean that it's meant necessarily for older audiences. People of all ages can enjoy such books, just like people of all ages could enjoy the simplistic style of the 1922 version. And I did have students that enjoyed that one, actually more so than the 2013 version. So it was really interesting to see the dynamics of the class in looking at these two and to get their opinions on these two stories. One of the aspects we discussed in our poetry theme during week 9 of this course was figurative language. This was primarily found within our textbook as well as the story My Man Blue. Because our poetry unit will be coming up in May at my school, I wanted to reserve the big overarching themes of this week for them, but I thought that it would at least be great to begin to introduce the students to figurative language. I will say, though, that I've learned in this class, and particularly through the articles on multicultural education, that teachers tend to allocate a designated portion of time for a given culture or topic, such as Black History Month, and then they don't look at it any other time of the year. Well, I'll admit I feel rather guilty that this has been the case with me in terms of poetry this year, but now that we only have May left, more or less, it's the only time I'll have for this theme. Beginning next year, however, I am planning to incorporate a set amount of time each week to exploring types of poetry and figurative language, so as not to fall into that trap of isolating poetry or anything else for that matter into a single month again. So to look at figurative language, I chose the story Owl Moon, written by Jane Yolen and illustrated by John Shaner. The girls tend to use the term literally a lot in my class, like literally a lot. So I asked them what it means when something happens literally. They told me that this is when something actually happens exactly the way it's said, like the boy literally ran a mile without stopping. So I questioned them again with, what about if something is figurative? What does it mean if something is said figuratively? They were able to infer that figurative was the opposite of literal based on my questioning. We then discussed the differences between similes and metaphors. We also discussed what it means when an object is personified. The girls recognized this term of personification from our week on traditional literature as an element when animals are personified, such as in fables. I read this story twice to them, since I've come to discover more and more in this course that there are definite benefits to rereading pieces of literature. And the first read was simply so that they could enjoy the story and understand the plot, so that they knew what was going on. While I read Owl Moon the second time, however, the students were asked to focus on instances in which they heard figurative language being used, particularly with regards to similes, metaphors, and personification. The students noted several examples, such as the ones shown on the slide, among others. And when I asked them how they felt about figurative language, they noted that they liked it because it allows people to use their imaginations more. They can compare people to things that aren't real, and they can describe unreal things like people. I thought that was really clever that they came up with that because I had never thought about it like that. So I appreciated their insights and I reflected with joy on how much they enjoyed discovering figurative language. Week 10's theme was based on informational nonfiction, so I decided to use one of my favorite books with the girls, Martin's Big Words, The Life of Martin Luther King Jr. by Dorian Rappaport and illustrated by Brian Collier. This is a picture book that is classified as a biography, so I felt that it would work well for this week. I actually had already read this story to the girls on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but in trying to stress to them that there can be great benefits in rereading a piece of literature, I decided to do this piece again. So I gave them two goals with this story. I wanted them to pick up on something that they didn't remember from their first reading of this book, and I wanted them to each give me a specific example that shows me that this is nonfiction. The girls were able to give me many more facts than I anticipated, so I was really happy about that. And what I really appreciated from their responses was that they were able to determine what was factual about the book and why. So, for example, they wouldn't just say that African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama boycotted the buses for 381 days. They would tell me that information and say that it was such because there's proof from witnesses and documents that say that this actually happened. It wasn't just something that was made up by the author. So each page of the story contains facts about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, and at the bottom of each page there's a quote by him. One of the students determined that this story was informational nonfiction because, and I quote, "The quotes were by him. They were telling us directly what he was thinking because these were his exact words. That gives us a lot of information on him," end quote. So while the other girls were giving me facts that they remembered, this girl's thought really stuck with me. I thought it was cool that she made that observation and that connection between the quotes and why that would be considered informational nonfiction. So my students told me that they really liked looking back at this story because there were some things that they had forgotten, like what a boycott meant, and that Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister like his father. They described nonfiction as telling facts, describing someone's life, saying how things work, and that it's not made up but actually real, as some of their responses. And one girl mentioned that she loved nonfiction because she likes to know how the world works, and these stories actually help her with that. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that she had convinced quite a few of her classmates to become more interested in how the world works too. And now they want to start this book club where they take a look specifically at nonfiction, just so that they can learn more from the books and from each other. So it's kind of like a teacher's dream in that respect. So unfortunately, due to snow days, standardized testing, and our Easter break and other various interruptions in our curriculum, we unfortunately did not have enough time to get to a few of the themes from this course that I was hoping to explore by now. But just because we haven't explored them doesn't mean that we won't explore them. So I have already begun to create lesson plans and take a look at some different ideas and books on the remaining themes that I'd like to explore with my students. And one of those themes is on disabilities. So disabilities is, of course, a very important topic to discuss with students. It's crucial that students understand that just because we don't necessarily look like each other or act like each other, sound like each other, just because we can't, some of us can't see or hear or have trouble comprehending certain things, it doesn't make us any less of a person. We're all still equal as human beings in that we are deserving of respect and integrity from one another. This is a concept I'm really working hard on getting across to my students, because I have one student in particular who has not been classified as having Asperger's syndrome, but we are in the process of documenting certain tendencies and that we've noticed with her and situations that we've experienced with her. And while she's a very sweet girl, there are times in which she tends to, for lack of a better term, get on the nerves of some of her classmates due to some of the things that she says or some of the ways that she acts. And so with the students, with my girls now getting ready to enter the 4th grade in a few months, it's my fear that they are going to begin to turn on her and form cliques if they don't understand what is happening with her. So it is a sensitive subject, I feel, to bring up, but at the same time, I don't want to shy away from it because I want to be able to help this student, and I want to help all of my students to understand that having a disability or being different in some way, shape, or form, it just makes you unique in your own way, and there's certainly positives of every person to be found. So I've been taking a look at some different books that I could use to explore different disabilities. And one of them that I came across was a book called Since We're Friends, which is an autism picture book. And it goes into the story of two friends, one of whom has autism, and he kind of struggles to relate well in different social situations, but his buddy is there to help him out. And so it shows that even though one of them has autism, they still get along beautifully, and they still learn to appreciate the world and appreciate each other um, in a very beautiful way. So this is one story that I'm taking a look at, and would possibly like to use with my students in the upcoming weeks. Another one is She Touched the World, which is by Sally Hobart Alexander and Robert Alexander. It's a story about a girl who loses her sight, her hearing, and most of her sense of smell and taste. So this story right away, I guess I kind of linked it in my mind to Helen Keller, who is somebody that the girls, they recognize that name and they understand a bit about her story. So it goes into this girl Laura's life and how she learns to read and write and communicate with other people, and how by the time she was a young adult, she was actually famous, because people were just fascinated by her and they wanted to get to know her. And so it shows that her disabilities with hearing and seeing weren't preventing her from having a fulfilling life. And that's something that I want my students to understand as well. The final book that I have up here is Do You Remember the Color Blue? And, it's questions that children ask about blindness, which I thought was fascinating. This is a story that I don't have in my possession just yet, but from the research that I've taken a look at, this one's also written by Sally Hobart Alexander, and it goes into her actual story. It's how she lost her sight at the age of 26. And, even though that was an extremely tough time for her, she still managed to find the positives in life, and she's now looking to educate other people on blindness and what life is like with blindness. So I thought it was really interesting because she answers questions that are asked specifically by young children about being blind. And I'm sure these are questions I can imagine that my students would have as well, even questions that I have. So I've heard that this book is awesome for both children and adults. So it's one that I would like to take a look at and possibly use with my students. And considering that this book is also written about a real person and about a real situation, I thought it would be kind of nice to link this to our informational nonfiction theme as well. Another area that I am looking to explore more in depth in my classroom is on verse poetry. So I didn't really know what verse poetry was prior to the start of this course. I knew that there was poetry out there in the form of novels, but I had never actually read one before. So after reading Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson, I was completely blown away. I knew after reading this that I wanted to take a look much further into the area of verse poetry, and certainly to bring it into my classroom. In looking and in researching for some possible ideas for verse poetry for third grade, unfortunately, so far I haven't really been able to find anything that I feel meshes well with our curriculum and our school pedagogy and the third grade level in particular. But I've been taking a look more at fifth grade because I've actually found out in the last few weeks that I will be transferring to the fifth grade next year. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity to take a look at some upper elementary verse poetry and to be able to use it in the fall with my students. And the really great thing too is that my students this year, they're not necessarily losing out altogether. It's just being postponed, I guess, more or less, because I will have them again in a couple of years. So I'll get a chance to use what I find with them as well eventually. One of the stories that I've been researching that I found to be excellent and I would love to use in my classroom is Bronx Masquerade, which won the Coretta Scott King Award, and it was written by Nikki Grimes, who also wrote My Man Blue, so I knew that in looking at her work, I can trust her as an accomplished, well-written author, and I'm very excited to take a look at this book in particular. I don't have the book with me just yet. I've been in the research phase of it still, but from what I've read on it, it goes into the life and times and the trials and tribulations and the triumphs of 18 urban teenagers. So it really goes into it gives students an in-depth look into the lives of students who live lives much differently from their own. Because my students come from upper middle class homes. Many of them are living in extreme wealth, and they don't necessarily get to see some of the different situations that other students their age are going through. So I think that this sounds like it would be an amazing, eye-opening experience for my students, both in looking at verse poetry in general, and then looking at these students in the Bronx in particular. So I feel like this story would give us a lot to talk about in terms of the verse poetry area of literature, but also getting to make the connections to multicultural literature as well. The final area that I wish to explore in further detail this year is on graphic novels. My students don't have a lot of experience with graphic novels from what I've seen, and I know this because in bringing Coraline to my classroom a couple weeks ago and in reading it, the girls were absolutely mesmerized by it. The idea of this comic book that wasn't really a comic book. It went into much more detail than a comic book and was certainly a lot bigger. That idea kind of blew their minds. So one of them was actually so interested, she asked me if she could borrow Coraline when I was finished with it. So it wouldn't surprise me if she's on the couch right now reading it. But in taking a look at some graphic novels that would tie to our social studies curriculum and our science curriculum as well, perhaps, is on the Inventions in Discovery series of graphic novels that I've been researching. I don't have these on me currently. Again, I'm still researching them to see if they would be worth purchasing for my classroom. But in what I've seen, so throughout this presentation, I've gone into the different observations that I've made and some of the different lessons that I've learned throughout this course while teaching in my classroom. And so these are just some final reflections that I wanted to touch on before finishing this presentation. So the first thing that I've learned is that students are genuinely interested in pursuing various genres of literature. And there didn't necessarily have to be a huge rhyme or reason to when I selected these lessons and when I implemented them in my classroom. A lot of times to my students, I think it seemed kind of random that I would jump from African American culture to Native American culture to figurative language to stereotyping and to pictures and to all the different things that we talked about. I think they found it as more of a fun mystery. It was, what's coming next? And, oh, cool, this is what we get to talk about this week. So I think they enjoyed that, and I was really glad that they were so receptive as to discover that literature is huge. It's this huge umbrella with so much under it to discover, and that they're really eager to do that. I've also learned that it's not enough to trust the information in the books we read simply because the author claims to have researched it. That was a very eye-opening thing for me after reading Beth Cannell's Darkness Under the Water. When I read the author's note from her, I was convinced that everything that she had said was true, and I would have taken it as truth with a grain of salt and not questioned it at all. After having read the different arguments from various reputable sources, however, I came to realize that It's startling how quickly I accepted one source as truth just because it was printed in text instead of found on the internet. And so it's really gotten me to see that before I introduce any type of literature into my classroom, I need to take that time to thoroughly research what it is that I'm bringing in. That's something I'm doing right now, and it's something that I will definitely continue to do throughout my professional life. I've learned that it's well worth the extra time to reread literature. Everything that my students read, I have read before. So this was my second, third, fourth, and so on time reading some of these selections with my students. And with each book that I read with them, I was still picking new things out of it because of the different perspectives that my students were giving me. So I'd like to actually expand that bullet point to say that it's also well worth the time, the extra time, just to sit down and have a well-rounded discussion with others, because the perspectives that you get are going to help you to look at stories in a whole new way. And a lot of times you can find great meaning in what others have to say that you would not have gotten otherwise. I've learned that relatability is not always critical to making meaningful connections to a text. Relatability, as I've said in previous papers, is something that I've clung on to pretty tightly. I've always liked to connect myself to different characters right off the bat while reading, but this course has helped me to see that I can still appreciate somebody for going through something that I have never experienced before, and that's okay. I don't have to find all these ways to connect to them to still appreciate what they're going through and to appreciate them more as people for taking on the struggles that they are. So that was something beautiful that I am glad I'm taking from this course. And particularly in looking at the teaching log, I've learned that a teaching log is a valuable tool in reflecting upon and assessing one's own teaching and comprehension of material. When I first discovered I was going to be doing a teaching log, I more or less thought that, well, okay, this could be an opportunity for me to do a lot of extra work and not get a lot out of it. But I chose to put that negativity out of my mind soon after, and I decided to keep an open mind and see where this took me. And I'm really glad that I did, because there is a lot that I got from this log. I was able to look back over different quotes from my students, different preconceptions and misconceptions that they had about topics, and I was able to tweak future lessons and modify them so that they were really fitting the needs of my students. And I'm grateful for that, because I don't think I would have done that otherwise. I would have more or less discussed literature with my students, but first of all, I wouldn't have done as much with these themes if we had not had the teaching log. And I think that our discussions wouldn't have been as rich, because I would have just assumed that I'd remember what they'd said. I don't know why I think I can do that, but I do sometimes. And so just in writing down what they wrote, or writing down what they said, and then getting to reflect on it later, I was able to pull certain phrases or certain ideas from them that I know I would have forgotten about, and I got to use that in future lessons. So I was really grateful for that. And so with that, that concludes my presentation. I was really grateful to have had the opportunity to take this course, and I look forward to using all of the information and the resources that I've attained from this course in future class lessons.